Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. It's time once again to remind everyone of the biblical command in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Because the criticism of the president is getting to the point of blasphemous disrespect for the man God has put in charge of this country. For in Romans 13, there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. And it is no small thing to disrespect God's delegated authority. For the verse goes on to say that those who resist the authority have opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. And so when we hear all of this vitriol against the president, we should fear the judgment of God that will fall upon these people. The early church father Irenaeus tells the story of the Apostle John running out of a building when he discovers that the false teacher Cerinthius is inside. The Apostle John wanted to put distance between himself and the wrath of God that would fall upon this man. We don't know if that story is true, but it reflects a healthy respect for God. But we live in a day when Robert De Niro can stand up at the Tony Awards and say F Trump and get a standing ovation. And it just shows how far our culture has fallen from any remnant of biblical truth. The fear of God is gone. In 1 Samuel 24:5, David's conscience was bothered because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Yet people today think nothing of cursing the president, even doing violence against staffers in the administration. It used to be that Americans would give respect to public officials because it was generally accepted in the public that to not do so was wrong. Most people didn't know where that attitude came from. It was kind of an unspoken rule. But it came from previous generations being raised in the Bible. Everyone used to go to church, and the Bible was read in the schools, and the people knew Romans chapter 13, and the people knew the admonition of 1 Peter 2:17, honor the king. Another well-known biblical law is Exodus 22:28. You shall not curse God, nor curse the ruler of your people. The Apostle Paul quotes that text in Acts 23:5, and Paul gives the sense of the Hebrew word to curse by using the Greek phrase to speak evil. But again, notice how the culture has lost any semblance of this value. The first generation without God loses the reason but keeps the morals. The second generation without God loses both the reason for the morals and the morals themselves. And this is where we're at today. We live in the midst of an ungodly generation that curses their God and their king. And because of this, the wrath of God is forthcoming. Now, lest someone think that I'm being partisan in this whole thing. Back in 2010, one of my first radio programs was entitled Honor the King, in regard to some hateful statements being made against President Obama. At that time, there were these bumper stickers that read, "Pray for President Obama," Psalm 109:8, which reads, "Let his days be few and another take his office." If you go online and Google Obama bumper stickers, it will remind you just how nasty some people were toward President Obama. And I reminded the Christian community at that time that kind of rhetoric has no place in Christianity. When Daniel spoke to the pagan king Darius, Daniel said, "O king, live forever." He did not say, "Let your days be few and another take your place." Did Daniel mean this, or was he just saying this to be polite? Well, in that Daniel was a prophet of the Lord, he wasn't lying, but he was to be an example to God's people. Our desire is for all men to literally live forever. And that's why Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, we're to pray for kings and all who are in authority because God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. And this goes for presidents on the political left, like President Obama, and for presidents on the political right, like Donald Trump. They both deserve our respect and our help, and we're to win them by our obedience and by our respect. So let me begin with an overview of what's going on, and then we're going to look at some biblical doctrine here. If you keep up with all the news, which I'm sure you do, you know of all the vile statements that have been made against the president from the Hollywood crowd. The media will do the same thing, but they'll couch it in political language. They'll say that Donald Trump is like Hitler, or he's a fascist, or he's like a dictator, that the president works for Vladimir Putin. After Trump's recent meeting in Helsinki with Putin, MSNBC contributor Jill Banks said about the meeting, "It's just as serious to me as the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of an attack, or the 9/11 attack. Trump's performance today will live in infamy as much as the Pearl Harbor attack, or the 1938 German Night of Broken Glass when the German people attacked the Jews." The former CIA director John Brennan tweeted, "Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises to and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous." But nothing coming out of that conference was anything like this. This was a complete mischaracterization out of animus toward the president. It wasn't right to mischaracterize President Obama's foreign policy meetings, nor is it right to mischaracterize President Trump's meetings. The biblical injunction to honor the king is not just a prohibition against cursing the king. Misreporting and fake news falls into the category of not honoring the president. And for the media to push this unsubstantiated story that Trump colluded with the Russian government to cheat on the election is a rebellion against authority in order to take that authority down by criticism. Lying about the president, even if you believe it's true, given your worldview, is still a crime against God's authority. It's like 1 Kings 21, when Jezebel made up an accusation against Naboth so that he would be put to death. Or Daniel chapter 6, where the government officials made up accusations against Daniel to get him thrown out of power. Or Esther chapter 3, where Haman makes a pretext to get rid of Mordecai. And look how the Sanhedrin made up accusations to get Jesus on the cross. There's an interesting character in the Old Testament by the name of Shimei. And he was part of Saul's administration. So he cursed David for replacing the administration of Saul. 2 Samuel 16. When David came to Bahurim, behold, there came out from there a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came out cursing continually as he came. He threw stones at David and at all of the servants of David, and all of the people and all the mighty men at his right hand and at his left. And Shimei said when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. The Lord has returned upon you all of the bloodshed of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. And behold, you are taken in your own evil, for you are a man of bloodshed. Shimei, of course, wanted the house of Saul to stay in power, because Saul's power was his power. And he was bitter over the rise of the house of David. And rather than going along with the program of God, he fought the program of God. He threw stones, physically and verbally, at the new administration. And notice the justification Shimei puts forth for his protests. That David was responsible for bloodshed. Apparently, the death of all the people in the house of Saul. But actually, Saul's general, Abner, was responsible for killing off the house of Saul. The house of Saul did it to themselves. But Shimei, in his partisanship, didn't see it that way. Saul lost, and therefore it must have been David's fault. And so he thought that he had the right to call David an evil man a man of bloodshed. Well, eventually, Shimei got his comeuppance. He was put to death under Solomon for another crime. Shimei's accountability is explained by Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 44. The king also said to Shimei, "You know all the evil which you acknowledge in your heart, which you did to my father David. Therefore the Lord shall return your evil on your own head." So notice that the biblical record is that it doesn't go well for all those who speak evil of rulers. Because those who oppose the magistrates that God ordains will receive condemnation upon themselves. Romans chapter 13, verse 2. And in the words of King David, when his men urged him to take the life of Saul, David said, "Who can lift his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" 1 Samuel 26:9. The Bible there is not referring to feelings of guilt, but moral culpability before God. And remember, Saul was no saint. David would not attack him in word or deed. And also David said later in 2 Samuel 1:14, then David said to him, "How is it that you are not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And so we can ask the same question today. How is it that these critics of the president are not afraid to attack the Lord's anointed? Now, are these attacks on President Trump worse than the attacks on President Obama? Well, in many ways, they're the same. They're worthless, rebellious despisers of authority on the political right and on the political left. The only difference now is that the media and Hollywood and academia is dishonoring the president. I mean, nobody was standing up at the Tony Awards saying F Obama and getting a standing ovation. The difference now is that the cultural leaders are against the president. And there are a number of video collages out there comparing the difference in the media's response to President Obama and then to President Trump when they're doing the exact same thing. The media fawned all over President Obama, making excuses for all of his gaffes, but everything Trump does is criticized. And the joke is, if President Trump walked on the water, the media would criticize him for not being able to swim. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Why is there such great criticism and disrespect toward this current president? The media will say it's because Trump is a bad person and he has bad policies and that the media is doing its job. Well, is it really based on some sort of moral stance against the president? Even if the president is immoral, disrespect and lies is still an unbiblical response. But if he is immoral, we can certainly understand better the media's suspicions and the media's outrage. But really, is this hatred of Donald Trump due to the fact that he's an immoral man? His affair with Stormy Daniels, the revelations about the Playboy model Karen McDougal? Well, it can't be that, because the media and Hollywood are all about sexual deviance. They are all in on the sexual revolution. Donald Trump is one of them. This goes on all the time in Hollywood and in the media. I think we could say that the media will use Trump's immorality to try to drive a wedge between him and his evangelical base. But that cannot be the real reason for the criticism of the president. I mean, we know that the media covered up and discounted the immorality of presidents and politicians who are on the side of the left. Well, maybe it's their hatred of Donald Trump because of his stance against illegal immigration. Well, go online and you can find from 2009 all the way up into 2016, President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, all saying that we need to stop illegal immigration at the border. President Obama, back in 2013, in his State of the Union address, said the following: "Real reforms means stronger border security, and we can build on the progress my administration has already made. putting more boots on the southern border than at any time in our history and reducing illegal crossings to their lowest level in 40 years. Real reforms means establishing a responsible pathway to earn citizenship, a path that includes passing a background check, paying taxes, and a meaningful penalty, learning English, and going to the back of the line behind the folks trying to come here legally. Well, back then, did the media cry out that President Obama was being racist against Mexicans? No. Did the politicians back then respond with sanctuary cities? No. President Obama was calling for more border security only 5 years ago. It wasn't as if in just 5 years the American people have fallen in love with illegal border crossers. So it's really not about immigrants. Well, maybe it's because of the president's egotism, his bravado. But no, it can't be that, because look at all of the egotism that is tolerated in Democratic candidates. And when it comes from Democrats, it's considered being a man. It's considered being humorous, being confident. The real reason for the criticism of the president is his identification with conservative values, with conservative ideas, pro-life, small government, nationalism. And this is also tribalism. The other party simply wants to take President Trump down because the Republicans are getting all the leadership positions in Washington. It's our team versus their team. And the left thought that they were going to win this presidency. And Democrats were supposed to hold on to the presidency for the next 100 years. And so to take back government, they need to make life miserable for Donald Trump. They must form a resistance against Trump. And anyone who is not criticizing Trump constantly is not being faithful to the resistance movement. Maxine Waters, in a talk at the First AME Church in Los Angeles, said God sent her on a mission against Trump. And so this is rebellion against authority based on a hatred of conservative policy and a desire for personal power. I mean, this is Shimei. When he loses power, he calls his opponent evil. This is 2 Samuel 15. Absalom, rising early and standing at the gate, telling everyone that the king is doing them wrong so that he could take the position of king. This is Judges chapter 9. Abimelech, criticizing his brothers so he could become king. You know, this is a lot like marriage. When you hate your spouse, when you want to get rid of your spouse, you find a pretext against them. You hate everything he or she does. You despise the gargling sound he makes when he's brushing his teeth, but when you're first married, you thought it was cute. Because the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated Jesus, they hated everything about him, even his miracles. And why did they hate Jesus? Because he rebuked their sin, and hence he threatened their power among the people. And this is why critics of the president will not obey 2 Peter 2:17. Honor the king. Because they cannot bring themselves to submit to authority. This is 2 Peter 2:10. These are people who despise authority, daring, self-willed. Now, conversely, let's talk about why evangelicals honor the president. It's because we have in our DNA 1 Peter 2:17. We must submit to the powers that be. We must support them as much as possible. We must counsel them. We must pray for them. It is not an option for us to lie about them or to undermine them. Now, evangelical support for the president has been mischaracterized by the media as some sort of hypocrisy or moral failure on the part of evangelicals. Don't you hate it when the media makes up their own reasons why evangelicals support the president or do a certain thing? It's kind of like when the Pharisees had to come up with an explanation for why the people are following Jesus. John chapter 7, they said it was because the people didn't know the law. It's because the people were ignorant. Now, that's not to say Donald Trump is Jesus, but it's an example of how people have to come up with a false reason in order to explain why others support their enemies. All the evangelicals I know support Donald Trump out of respect for the office. Nobody appreciates his personal immorality. But at least he is open to listening to Christian political leaders, those who respect him. And he has appointed many Christians in his administration. The Secretary of State, the head of the EPA, the ambassador to the UN, the head of HUD, the head of the Department of Education, and even his own vice president. Donald Trump is so much like King Nebuchadnezzar, an ungodly man who surrounds himself with Daniel and his three friends, and Nebuchadnezzar was eventually converted. See, President Obama, on the other hand, was a leftist ideologue. He surrounded himself with well-known leftists. Christians need not apply. And the irony is that if the left would treat Donald Trump with some respect, he would probably lean more toward the left. But in the providence of God, their hatred of him has alienated them from his administration. You know, I really don't understand the presidency of Donald Trump. It's not a script that I would have written for the world. I really wanted to see a solid Christian get into office so that if there was any criticism or vitriol, it would have to be against the policies themselves. The vitriol could not hide under the guise of the president's demeanor or his personal morals. The media, rather than attacking the man, would have to attack the policies themselves. But with Donald Trump, the waters all get muddied. Critics can hide their liberal agenda behind the president's morals and etiquette by attacking the misspelling of his tweets, by attacking the tone of his tweets. But God knows what he's doing. He puts the Nebuchadnezzars of this world on the throne. Psalm 75, not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the desert comes exaltation, but God is judge. He puts down one and exalts another. For a cup is in the hand of the Lord, and the wine foams. It is well mixed. He pours out of this. Surely all the wicked of the earth must drain and drink down its dregs. We have to accept the cup of authority that God puts over us. So let me sum up all of this with a general overview of what the Bible has to say about respecting and honoring magistrates. First, non-violence. We are not to take up arms against the state. John chapter 18, verse 36. Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting." Matthew 26:52. When Jesus was arrested by the Roman soldiers, Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword." And these words of Jesus has made all of the difference in the Christian faith. And because of these verses, Christians do not use force to spread the gospel, nor to correct the government. The Quran, on the other hand, has a different teaching. Surah chapter 2, I think verse 19, which reads, "And kill the unbelievers wherever you find them." And because of this principle in the Quran, Muslim clergy have issued fatwas to murder infidels or government officials who are not practicing Islam faithfully. In Islam, the responsibility of the church and the state are merged. But Christianity teaches nonviolence against the state and unbelievers. But the Bible takes this to a second level. Not only are we to be nonviolent, we're also to obey the state. 1 Peter 2:13. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to kings as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Oftentimes, we will hear the argument that we don't have to obey government because government is corrupt. We only have to obey good government. Well, remember, the apostles are given this instruction when Nero is on the throne, and Rome is a totalitarian state. And notice the next verse in 1 Peter 2:18. Honor the king, Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. Now, we understand the human logic of those patriots who believe that the way to change government is by disobeying government. A seemingly effective means of getting bad government to change is by resistance. And the argument is the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And so if we'd all stand up to government, if we'd all disobey government, we would apparently have more freedom. But we cannot operate on human reason. We have to operate on scriptural authority. God says that the best way to change a country is by submission and obedience. We may not see that, but in the long run, obedience does accomplish more good. 1 Peter 2. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. So never put the teaching of Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson or Patrick Henry above the teaching of the New Testament. So those are the first two levels in our response to the state. No violence, and then second, obedience, but there is still a third level. Honor the state. Paul writes in Romans 13, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And this is where we need to examine our hearts. Because there are many Christians who would never think of doing violence against the state, and they would never disobey the laws of the land. But they're not very good at honoring government officials they don't like. But the Bible says we are to bless these officials. 1 Peter 3:8, to sum up, all of you are to be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. And this is why it was so disconcerting to Christians to hear President Obama's pastor back in Chicago, Jeremiah Wright, say, not God bless America, but God damn America. Now, does honoring the state mean that Christians should never correct the state or the president? No, our job is actually to correct, but to do it in the spirit of helpfulness. Remember how Daniel corrected Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel 4:27, therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquity by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. And notice in Luke chapter 3, we read that the prophet John reprimanded Herod because Herod took Herodias, his brother's wife, and because of all the wicked things which Herod had done. Was the prophet John dishonoring Herod when John publicly spoke about Herod's evils? No. We should never define honoring as complicity or being a politician's lapdog. And there is a place for Christians to prod the government with some satirical wit and sarcasm. Jesus called Herod that fox. And remember, Elijah mocked the prophets of Baal, saying, well, maybe Baal is not listening to you because he's using the bathroom. And Isaiah called the tree huggers of his day stupid and deluded. So there's a place for sharp, pungent commentary to get people's attention. The biblical standard for speech is not, we cannot hurt anyone's feelings. But in all this, we need to be very, very careful. We must be respectful. We must learn all of these scriptures and be led of the Holy Spirit to apply them correctly. So here's an example. This week, Donald Trump tweeted out about Omarosa, calling her a dog. Now, the term dog is a pejorative with many different meanings. It's actually used in the Bible. It's very common in the Middle East. But in our culture, it's a loaded word. But this is what we get from President Trump. He can be crude, he's unrefined, and sometimes he just says some dumb stuff. So my advice to you, O King, is to use language that makes the point, but doesn't give ammunition to your enemies. It would have been more effective for President Trump to tweet, "I hope she gets the professional help she needs." That would appear compassionate, but at the same time, subtly calling her an idiot. Well, that kind of advice corrects the president, but it's respectful. But the media's response to Trump's tweets was that he's a racist, he's a misogynist, he's a bully, and the media doesn't even see their own hypocrisy in all this. Because they have no moral argument against Donald Trump, because they are just as disrespectful toward him as he is toward Omarosa. So why should anyone listen to the media? And why should anyone listen to us if we disrespect authority? And that's Peter's point in 1 Peter 2. Submit yourself to the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether to kings as to one in authority, or to governors as sent by him. Then verse 15, for such is the will of God, that by doing right, by doing this, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. You get more bees with honey than with vinegar. And remember, in this text, we are given the prime example of someone with great authority who did not return evil for evil, the Lord Jesus Christ. Same chapter, verse 21. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ has suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. No threats, no reviling, no exaggeration, no virtue signaling, no sin. And I want you to see one more point Peter makes in chapter 2 here. Peter writes, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to kings and governors. Then he says, by doing right, we will silence the ignorance of foolish men. But then he makes this very interesting comment in verse 16. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. So what could act as free men possibly mean? That command is actually very encouraging and liberating for the Christian. See, in the Roman Empire, there were slaves and there were free men. And a slave could not or would not exercise any human rights. Slaves would keep quiet. Slaves would not engage in any public discussion. They couldn't even vote. But a free man held his head high, engaged in public discourse. He could demand his rights. A free man was not an enemy of society, but he considered himself part of the city. So I believe what Peter is saying here is that just because we're Christians and we're to submit to kings and governors, we ought not to cower, but to exercise all of our Christian liberty. But Peter adds, do not use that freedom as a covering for evil. And that's exactly what some people do. They covered their pride and their rebellion against authority by claiming to be American patriots, by claiming to stopping evil by their criticism and their obstructionism. And again, this is where we need to examine our own hearts, because there are many Christians who would never think of doing violence against the state. They would never think of disobeying the laws of the land, but they're not very good at honoring government officials who they don't like. So maybe this is a new area of obedience you need to step into. Now, some quick takes on the culture. Last week, the media pundit Alex Jones and InfoWars was banned from Apple, Facebook, and YouTube. This didn't just happen out of the blue. 3 weeks earlier, Democrats were calling upon these platforms to take down Alex Jones. And this is how the left is shutting down conservative sites, conservative speakers, by complaining. And businesses do not like customers complaining. But Alex Jones is a problem child on the right. He gives conservatives a bad name by his false conspiracy theories and his overall arrogance. And whenever I think of Alex Jones, I think of 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 2, about false teachers who give the truth a bad name. Because of them, the way of truth will be maligned. Like Harold Camping giving the second coming of Christ a bad name. If conservatism is Alex Jones, well then run from conservatism. And that's exactly what Satan wants. So he sends crazy people into our ranks. This is really not a free speech issue because these are private platforms. Conservative platforms like CRTV and the Daily Wire would never give Alex Jones a show, nor a liberal commentator. Someday, all conservatives are going to be thrown off of these platforms, these larger media platforms. We'll just have to wait to see how many more conservatives get banned. But the answer here is for conservatives to create more alternative sources of media to break the Facebook and the YouTube monopoly. More breaking news this week. The Roman Catholic Church sex scandal continues. Grand jury in PA issued a report against 300 priests in PA. Eventually, I expect these will become indictments. The article reads, a long-awaited state grand jury reported into sexual abuse in 6 Pennsylvania dioceses, including Pittsburgh and Greensburg, has finally been released. The 884-page document, 2 years in the making, shines a light into the dark corners of these dioceses going back 7 decades, exposing the predators and the efforts of their bishops to protect them. Today, the most comprehensive report on child sexual abuse within the church ever produced in our country was released. Attorney General Josh Shapiro said, Pennsylvanians can finally learn the extent of sexual abuse in these dioceses. For the first time, we can all begin to understand the systematic cover-up by church leaders that followed. The abuse scarred every diocese. The cover-up was sophisticated. The church protected the institution at all costs. Is this an exception? Some people say it is. Let's not indict the entire religion, they say. But no, when the Islamist grooming gangs in the UK raped 400 girls, it was because there is an intrinsic problem in the religion. I've heard from many sources that Roman Catholic seminaries are homosexual cabals. The priest, Philip DeVos, tweeted out this week the following: I've given my whole life to serving Christ and his church. Since beginning seminary in 1994, every year has brought fresh revelations of the darkest corruption, along with criminal moral perversions coupled to unbelievable levels of incompetence. Then I read the papers or catch the evening news, and I see cardinals and bishops that I know for a fact are lying with impunity, deploying weasel words and fake emotions. Until I went to seminary, I was not aware of knowing a single criminal sexual abuser. Since then, apparently, I have rubbed elbows with dozens, some being high-ranking prelates. And those are just the ones whose names have been made into reports and news stories. Without the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, the bishops would still be lying, obfuscating, and making asinine and entirely forgettable remarks about the economy and immigration, while ignoring corruption, abuse of power, criminal carnality, abortion procedures by predatory priests, systematic homosexual predation, pedophilia, sexual harassment, and rape in their own ranks. And despite these revelations, they don't appear to be all that upset about it. So why is this going on? Well, it's the made-up doctrine of celibacy in the priesthood that attracts those who are sexually troubled. The New Testament itself teaches that false teachers will promote celibacy. 1 Timothy chapter 4, by means of the hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience with a branding iron, men who forbid marriage. And the New Testament tells us that marriage is honorable in all. The marriage bed is holy. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. But whenever a religious group comes along and says marriage is dishonorable, that spells trouble. People seeking to get holiness, not through Christ, but through these external ascetic practices, celibacy. And all this goes to show that the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of Rome. It is not the Church of Jesus Christ. It is not infallible. It is not the one true church. The Church of Jesus Christ exists beyond these human titles and human organizations. The true Church of Jesus Christ follows the scripture over men. What else? The brouhaha about President Trump tweeting out that the news media is the enemy of the people. This sounds really bad because the phrase enemy of the people was used by Stalin to incite hatred against particular social groups. So Jim Acosta at CNN made a big deal about this. At the White House press briefing, he insisted that Sarah Sanders say that the press is not the enemy of the people. But there is one thing Acosta cleverly twisted. President Trump did not originally tweet that the press was the enemy of the people. President Trump wrote that the fake news media, the New York Times, NBC, ABC, CBS, and CNN, is not my enemy, it's the enemy of the American people. Trump did not say all of the media. He specified certain media. Acosta seems to think he's the only media. So why didn't Acosta ask Sanders, would you say right now that CNN is not the enemy of the people? Because he wanted to make it appear as if President Trump was against all of the media, and this is deceitful misrepresentation, just as I addressed in this program. Now, from a societal point of view, Trump's tweets were necessary. The media is to be the watchdog of the government, but the people are to be the watchdog of the media. The media is not above accountability. The media is not exempt from the First Amendment right to criticize the media. And the fact that 100 media outlets are planning to criticize the president for criticizing them just shows how much the media thinks they're above criticism. That First Amendment rights are fine as long as First Amendment rights are not used against them. They dish it out, but they're not willing to take it. So Trump tweets, the fake news hates me, saying that they are the enemy of the people only because they know it's true. I'm providing a great service by explaining this to the American people. They purposely cause division and distrust. They can also cause war. They are very dangerous and sick. Well, I want to live in a country where the president can say this to the American people without the media complaining that he has no right to do so. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for making God and Country Biblical Exposition part of your discipleship in the Word. The contact information is on the closing slide. May God richly bless you as you live by His Word.